What's up, guys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and in this episode we're going to be finishing up Chapter 3 of Blackshirts and Reds. We're about halfway through right now. The chapter's called Left Anticommunism. We're going to be starting on page 49 and doing about 10 pages today. This is interesting. It talks a little bit about people that want to achieve socialism as an ideal and how they tend to be they're called pure socialists. They tend to reject socialist revolutions based on this thing or that seem more or less arbitrary because it doesn't match up to their ideals. These are the people that are on the left right now that call themselves socialists but always reject every movement that comes along on the basis of something that they find distasteful, and how these ideologues actually hinder a movement. And then there's other types of socialists that are basically like, they'll grasp onto any type of movement that's against capitalism and imperialism and ride that movement. I tend to be part of that group, where I'm not willing to sabotage or, not get on board with a certain revolution because of some piddly little disagreement I have with one of its leaders or with some of the people involved. If you're against our imperial hegemonic capitalist system, I'm on board for whatever revolution you're up for. So this is interesting. We're going to start on page 49 here. The upheavals in Eastern Europe did not constitute a defeat for socialism because socialism never existed in those countries, according to some U.S. leftists. They say that the communist states offered nothing more than bureaucratic one-party state capitalism or some such thing. Whether we call the former communist countries socialist is a matter of definition. Suffice it to say, they constituted something different from what existed in the profit-driven capitalist world, as the capitalists themselves were not slow to recognize. First, in communist countries, there was less economic inequality than under capitalism. The perks enjoyed by party and government elites were modest by corporate CEO standards in the West, as were their personal incomes and lifestyles. Soviet leaders like Yuri Andropov and Leonid Brezhnev lived not in lavishly appointed mansions like the White House, but in relatively large apartments in a housing project near the Kremlin set aside for government leaders. They had limousines at their disposal, like most other heads of state, and access to large dachas where they entertained visiting dignitaries, but they had none of the immense personal wealth that most U.S. leaders possess. The lavish life enjoyed by East Germany's party leaders, as widely publicized in the U.S. press, included a $725 a yearly allowance in hard currency and housing in an exclusive settlement on the outskirts of Berlin that sported a sauna, an indoor pool, and a fitness center shared by all the residents. They also could shop in stores that carried Western goods such as bananas, jeans, and Japanese electronics. The U.S. press never pointed out that ordinary East Germans had access to public pools and gyms and could buy jeans and electronics, though usually not of the imported variety. Nor was the lavish consumption enjoyed by the East German leaders contrasted to the truly opulent lifestyle enjoyed by the Western plutocracy. Second, in communist countries, productive forces were not organized for capital gain and private enrichment. Public ownership of the means of production supplanted private ownership. Individuals could not hire other people and accumulate great personal wealth from their labor. Again, compared to Western standards, differences in earnings and savings among the populace were generally modest. The income spread between the highest and lowest earners in the Soviet Union was about 5 to 1. In the United States, the spread in yearly income between the top multi-billionaires and the working class is more like 10,000 to 1. And remember, this also, I think he wrote this in the late 90s, so it's been 20 years. It's probably worse than that now. Third, priority was placed on human services. Though life under communism left a lot to be desired and the services themselves were rarely the best, communist countries did guarantee their citizens some minimal standard of economic survival and security, including guaranteed education, employment, housing, and medical assistance. Fourth, communist countries did not pursue the capital penetration of other countries. Lacking a profit motive as their motor force and therefore having no need to constantly find new investment opportunities, they did not expropriate the lands, labor, markets, and natural resources of weaker nations. That is, they did not practice economic imperialism. The Soviet Union conducted trade and aid relations on terms that generally were favorable to the Eastern European nations and Mongolia, Cuba, and India. All of the above were organizing principles for every communist system to one degree or another. None of the above applied to free market countries like Honduras, Guatemala, Thailand, South Korea, Chile, Indonesia, Zaire, Germany, or the US. But a real socialism, it is argued, would be controlled by the workers themselves through direct participation instead of being run by Leninists, Stalinists, Castroites, or other ill-willed, power-hungry bureaucratic cabals of evil men who betray revolutions. Unfortunately, this pure socialism view is ahistorical and non-falsifiable. It cannot be tested against the actualities of history. It compares an ideal against an imperfect reality, and the reality comes off a poor second. It imagines what socialism would be like in a world far better than this one, where no strong state structure or security force is required, where none of the value produced by workers needs to be expropriated to rebuild society and defend it from invasion and internal sabotage. The pure socialists' ideological anticipations remain untainted by existing practice. They do not explain how the manifold functions of a revolutionary society would be organized, how external attack and internal sabotage would be thwarted, how bureaucracy would be avoided, scarce resources allocated, policy differences settled, priorities set, and production and distribution conducted. Instead, they offer vague statements about how the workers themselves will directly own and control the means of production and will arrive at their own solutions through creative struggle. No surprise then that the pure socialists support every revolution except the ones that actually succeed. The pure socialists had a vision of a new society that would create and be created by new people, a society so transformed in its fundaments as to leave little opportunity for wrongful acts, corruption, and criminal abuses of state power. There would be no bureaucracy or self-interested coteries, no ruthless conflicts or hurtful decisions. When the reality proves different and more difficult, some on the left proceed to condemn the real thing and announce that they feel, quote-unquote, betrayed by this or that revolution. The pure socialists see socialism as an ideal that was tarnished by communist venality, duplicity, and power cravings. The pure socialists opposed the Soviet model but offer little evidence to demonstrate that other paths could have been taken, that other models of socialism, not created from one's imagination but developed through actual historical experience, could have taken hold and worked better. Was an open, pluralistic, and democratic socialism actually possible at this historic juncture? The historical evidence would suggest it was not. As the political philosopher Carl Shames argued, quote, "How do the left critics know that the fundamental problem was the nature of the ruling revolutionary parties rather than, say, the global concentration of capital that is destroying all independent economies and putting an end to national sovereignty everywhere? And to the extent that it was, where did this nature come from? Was this nature disembodied, disconnected from the fabric of the society itself, from the social relations impacting on it? Thousands of examples could be found in which the centralization of power was a necessary choice in securing and protecting socialist relations. In my observation of existing communist societies, the positive of quote-unquote socialism and the negative of quote-unquote bureaucracy, authoritarianism, and tyranny interpenetrated in virtually every sphere of life." That's from 1992. The pure socialists regularly blame the left itself for every defeat it suffers. Their second guessing is endless, so we hear that revolutionary struggles fail because their leaders wait too long or act too soon, are too timid or too impulsive, too stubborn or too easily swayed. We hear that the revolutionary leaders are compromising or adventuristic, bureaucratic, or opportunistic, rigidly organized or insufficiently organized, undemocratic, or failing to provide strong leadership. But always the leaders fail because they do not put their trust in the quote-unquote direct actions of the workers, who apparently would withstand and overcome every adversity if only given the kind of leadership available from the left's critics' own groupuscle. Unfortunately, the critics seem unable to apply their own leadership genius to producing a successful revolutionary movement in their own country. Tony Febo questioned this blame the leadership syndrome of the pure socialists. Quote, "It occurs to me that when people as smart, different, dedicated, and heroic as Lenin, Mao, Fidel Castro, Daniel Ortega, Ho Chi Minh, and Robert Mugabe, and the millions of heroic people who followed and fought with them, all end up more or less in the same place. Then something bigger is at work than who made what decision and at what meeting, or even what size houses they went home to after that meeting. These leaders weren't in a vacuum. They were in a whirlwind, and the suction, the force, the power that was twirling them around has spun and left this globe mangled for more than 900 years. And to blame this or that theory or this or that leader is a simple-minded substitute for the kind of analysis that Marxists should make. It's from 1991. To be sure, the pure socialists are not entirely without specific agendas for building the revolution. After the Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua, an ultra-left group in that country called for direct worker ownership of the factories. The armed workers would take control of production without benefit of managers, state planners, bureaucrats, or a formal military. While undeniably appealing, this workers' syndicalism denies the necessities of state power. Under such an arrangement, the Nicaraguan revolution would not have lasted 2 months against the US-sponsored counter-revolution that savaged the country. It would have been unable to mobilize enough resources to field an army, take security measures, or build and coordinate economic programs and human services on a national scale. Decentralization versus survival. For a people's revolution to survive, it must seize state power and use it to A, break the stranglehold exercised by the owning class over the society's institutions and resources, and B, withstand the reactionary counterattack that is sure to come. That second part is very important. A lot of people don't think that far ahead. That's important. Let's read that again. And B, withstand the reactionary counterattack that is sure to come. The internal and external dangers of a revolution necessitate a centralized state power that is not particularly to anyone's liking, not in Soviet Russia in 1917, nor in Sandinista Nicaragua in 1980. Engels offers an opposite account of an uprising in Spain in 1872-73, in which anarchists seized power in municipalities across the country. At first the situation looked promising. The king had abdicated, and the bourgeois government could muster but a few thousand ill-trained troops. Yet this ragtag force prevailed because it faced a thoroughly parochialized rebellion. Quote, each town proclaimed itself as a sovereign canton and set up a revolutionary committee, a junta. Engels writes, quote, each town acted on its own, declaring that the important thing was not cooperation with other towns, but separation from them, thus precluding any possibility of a combined attack against bourgeois forces. It was the fragmentation and isolation of the revolutionary forces which enabled the government troops to smash one revolt after the other. End quote. Decentralized parochial autonomy is the graveyard of insurgency, which may be one reason why there has never been a successful anarcho-syndicalist revolution. Ideally, it would be a fine thing to have only local, self-directed worker participation with minimal bureaucracy, police, and military. This probably would be the development of socialism, were socialism ever allowed to develop unhindered by counter-revolutionary subversion and attack. And that right there is why I tend to be, like, not quite anarcho-syndicalist, where I don't want like individual towns kind of cooperating but having their own municipalities that are kind of isolated from one another. That may be where socialism heads in the future, but to take over a corrupt and extremely powerful government, you have to kind of take over that government and then use that government as a socialist tool to eventually break itself down, and then we head towards that in the future. But skipping that step, that's why they're always able to take down those types of revolutions, is because the government then steps in and crushes the ants individually with a few steps. So that's why I think that subversion and using the tools and infrastructure that are in place right now that the government uses is probably the best way to take the next step, and we'll head towards that sort of isolated anarcho-syndicalist type socialism 100 years from now or something. I don't know. Let's keep going. We're on page 54. One might recall how, in 1918 to 1920, 14 capitalist nations, including the U.S., invaded Soviet Russia in a bloody but unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the revolutionary Bolshevik government. The years of foreign invasion and civil war did much to intensify the Bolshevik siege psychology with its commitment to lockstep party unity and a repressive security apparatus. Thus, in May 1921, the same Lenin who had encouraged the practice of internal party democracy and struggle against Trotsky in order to give the trade unions a greater measure of autonomy, now called for an end to workers' opposition and other factional groups within the party. Quote, "The time has come," he told an enthusiastically concurring 10th Party Congress, quote, "to put an end to opposition, to put a lid on it. We have had enough opposition." Open disputes and conflicting tendencies within and without the party, the communists concluded, created an appearance of division and weakness that invited attack by formidable foes. Only a month earlier, in April 1921, Lenin had called for more worker representation in the party's Central Committee. In short, he had become not anti-worker but anti-opposition. Here was a social revolution, like every other, that was not allowed to develop its political and material life in an unhindered way. By the late 1920s, the Soviets faced the choice of A, moving in a still more centralized direction with a command economy and forced agrarian collectivization and full-speed industrialization under a commandist autocratic party leadership, the road taken by Stalin, or B, moving in a liberalized direction, allowing more political diversity, more autonomy for labor unions and other organizations, more open debate and criticism, greater autonomy among the various Soviet republics, a sector of privately owned small businesses, independent agricultural development by the peasantry, greater emphasis on consumer goods, and less effort given to the kind of capital accumulation needed to build a strong military-industrial base. The latter course, I believe, would have produced a more comfortable, more humane, and more serviceable society. Siege socialism would have given way to worker-consumer socialism. The only problem is that the country would have risked being incapable of withstanding the Nazi onslaught. Instead, the Soviet Union embarked upon a rigorous, forced industrialization. This policy has often been mentioned as one of the wrongs perpetrated by Stalin upon his people. It consisted mostly of building, within a decade, an entirely new, huge industrial base east of the Urals, in the middle of the barren steppes, the biggest steel complex in Europe, in anticipation of an invasion from the West. Quote, "Money was spent like water, men froze, hungered, and suffered, but the construction went on with a disregard for individuals and a mass heroism seldom paralleled in history." Stalin's prophecy that the Soviet Union had only 10 years to do what the British had done in a century proved correct. When the Nazis invaded in 1941, that same industrial base, safely ensconced thousands of miles from the front, produced the weapons of war that eventually turned the tide. The cost of this survival included 22 million Soviet citizens who perished in the war and immeasurable devastation and suffering, the effects of which would distort Soviet society for decades afterwards. All this is not to say that everything Stalin did was of historical necessity. The exigencies of revolutionary survival did not, quote-unquote, make inevitable the heartless execution of hundreds of old Bolshevik leaders, the personality cult of a supreme leader who claimed every revolutionary gain as his own achievement, the suppression of party political life through terror, the eventual silencing of debate regarding the pace of industrialization and collectivization, the ideological regulation of all intellectual and cultural life, and the mass deportations of, quote-unquote, suspect nationalities. The transforming effects of counter-revolutionary attack have been felt in other countries. A Sandinista military officer I met in Vienna in 1986 noted that Nicaraguans were, quote-unquote, not a warrior people, but they had to learn to fight because they faced a destructive U.S.-sponsored mercenary war. She bemoaned the fact that the war and embargo forced her country to postpone much of its socio-economic agenda. As with Nicaragua, so with Mozambique, Angola, and numerous other countries in which U.S.-financed mercenary forces destroyed farmlands, villages, health centers, and power stations while killing or starving hundreds of thousands. The revolutionary baby was strangled in its crib or mercilessly bled beyond recognition. This reality ought to earn at least as much recognition as the suppression of dissidents in this or that revolutionary society. The overthrow of Eastern European and Soviet communist governments was cheered by many left intellectuals. Now democracy would have its day. The people would be free from the yoke of communism, and the U.S. left would be free from the albatross of existing communism, or as left theorist Richard Lichtman put it, quote unquote, liberated from the incubus of the Soviet Union and the succubus of communist China. Sound a little bit like today? In fact, the capitalist restoration in Eastern Europe seriously weakened the numerous Third World liberation struggles that had received aid from the Soviet Union and brought a whole new crop of right-wing governments into existence, ones that now worked hand in glove with the U.S. global counter-revolutionaries around the globe. In addition, the overthrow of communism gave the green light to the unbridled exploitative impulses of Western corporate interests. No longer needing to convince workers that they live better than their counterparts in Russia, and no longer restrained by a competing system, the corporate class is rolling back the many gains that working people in the West have won over the years. Now that the free market in its meanest form is emerging triumphant in the East, so will it prevail in the West. Quote, capitalism with a human face is being replaced by capitalism in your face, as Richard Levins put it, quote, so in the new exuberant aggressiveness of world capitalism, we see what communists and their allies had held at bay. Having never understood the role that existing communist powers played in tempering the worst impulses of Western capitalism and imperialism, and having perceived communism as nothing but an unmitigated evil, the left anti-communists did not anticipate the losses that were to come. Some of them still don't get it. So we'll start chapter 4, Communism in Wonderland, page 59 tomorrow, guys. Sorry it took me so while to get it to you. I have worked a lot over the last 20 days or so. I've only had like 3 days off. So apologies. I'll get the next chapter to you over the next day. Keep fighting that good fight out there.